Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Market Talk from MEED. Today we're going to look at the steel industry. The steel industry, of course, is a major part of the project sector and has faced many challenges, just as the construction and projects market has done over the past few years. I'm joined by Asim Siddiqui, who is the Managing Director of the UAE-based Age Steel Industries, and also Rohit Valrani, who is the Managing Director of also UAE-based Seven Seas Steel Industries. I'm going to come to you, Asim, first. Thank you first for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just get the big picture sorted out. What is your view of where the steel industry in the UAE and the GCC, I guess, is today after the sort of slowdown of the past few years?
Yeah.
What are the characteristics of the market?
Well, Richard, I think with regards to the steel industry, it's a global phenomena. It's not just what's happening in the Middle East here. We're going through a period of overcapacity, too much supply. We had this Chinese construction, boom from the 2003 to 2008. A lot of countries built capacities, invested in steel being a strategic sector in their economy. And we suddenly got to a point where more players came into the market, and right now we're seeing a lot more players in the market. Competition is fierce, margins are a lot tighter, and of course, with a slowdown in construction, we're seeing liquidity tighten up, and those challenges are now facing. Now, many people say it's a cyclical market. Commodities are a cyclical market. So some are cyclical changes, and some are perhaps more structural changes. So we're seeing a combination of both impact the market.
What do you see as the structural changes?
Well, I think, for instance, last year we had the imposition of VAT, which is something which was new. Businesses before weren't sort of like, the transparency element wasn't there as much as it is perhaps now becoming. We had Al-Ittihad Credit Bureau reports now coming out. We didn't have any kind of credit bureau 5-10 years ago. So we're seeing like more transparency coming into the market, but, and perhaps a more check on reality than any more time than before.
So are you saying that there are, you are saying that there's an oversupply at the moment, a correction due to oversupply? But it sounds like you're saying there are two factors in that. One is the local slowdown, the regional slowdown due to oil prices, government cutbacks in spending. But a second is overcapacity in China, and so we're getting extra steel coming in, plus a slowdown in demand.
Well, I mean, you must have been reading it in the news a lot. There's been a lot of protectionism going on, tariffs, talk of trade tariffs coming on board. So where we've seen, as I mentioned before, governments invest heavily, and the government here has invested heavily in Emirates Steel, for instance, to build its capacity for steel. This has happened around the world, and China has invested heavily during this period. But when the slowdown has also occurred in China, we've seen growth moderate. The market's correcting itself in terms of the overcapacity. In China, they're looking at national, merging a lot of the industries together and bringing in fewer players controlling much bigger sectors of the market. Here as well, what we're noticing, is that we have many, many more players in the market today in our structural steel sector than we did 10 years ago. So competition is extremely fierce, and I think we're getting to a stage where best practices may not be properly followed now at the sake of getting the order.
And do you think some structural steel suppliers are at risk? If there's people coming in at very low prices and payments are being delayed?
Well, I think, at the moment, we're not just steel suppliers. We're actually being used as a cheap form of financing tool in the supply chain. We're seeing extended credit periods develop in the market, delayed payments happening in the market, which is adding to cash flow pressure on businesses in the steel, particularly steel traders. And yes, I think in any industry, cash flow is probably your number one cause for an industry to go through many problems, if not businesses to collapse. And so steel traders have to be careful how they manage that cash flow, how they do business today. It's changing. the way we do business is changing. 10 years ago, many steel traders' main point was, let's try and get as much business as possible. Look at top line, turnover, build the turnover. Now, I think it's more a question of look at the net profit, the bottom line now. The turnover is not so important as before.
So it's all about efficiency and productivity.
We're going towards quality, whereas before we were thinking of more quantity and as much quantity as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll come back on some of those points. Rohit, if I can turn to you. Now, you represent a different side of the steel sector, the reinforcement steel community, rebar
Correct,
industry.
that's right.
Is it the same story on the rebar side as it is on the structural steel side, or is it different? And if so, can you explain that a little bit?
I think you'll find that generally it's the entire steel industry that's going through a similar issue. As Asim said, we do have an issue here being utilized as a cheap form of financing in this market today. The way the business is being done has changed over the years. We have an oversupply similar to the structural steel and the rebar side. We have a large number of traders within the market which are also finding somehow ability to get cheap financing. Overall, I think you'll find that there is a flight from volume and quantity to quality. We're finding it a little challenging in terms of being able to get information flow between the various segments of the steel industry. You find that...
Can I just ask you a little bit about
Sure.
that point? So what information flow is required between the segments, and what segments are you referring to? Do you mean the coordination between different players in the rebar side, or do you mean
That's
between
correct.
structural steel and rebar?
I think primarily you'll find that the coordination between the rebar side. Over the years, there has been a large focus on quantity. When the market was on an upward cycle, it's great. You know, you sort of you don't have an issue with selling, but then you get used to that selling. You get used to those volumes. And when the market starts to contract, you need to also adjust to that. The problem is that once you're looking at the top line, and that's always been your focus, and not have to concern yourself about the bottom line because it was always there. Today you find yourself in a situation where top line is less important, and as Asim said, and I have to agree with him, the bottom line is extremely important. So as a business ourselves, we've sort of gone away from just looking at volumes. We don't necessarily target the big jobs anymore. We target the more profitable jobs. We look at very much
So
the
how do you
customer.
identify those? How can you know if...
Well, one of the most important things for us is knowing the payment cycle. If we're dealing with a customer and we know that they have had a good history with us, or we've seen it generally in the market through know-how, we've been in the industry for so many years, we generally get to hear what's happening in the market. We find that we are okay with giving them credit on the assumption that they'll be paying at regular intervals and not extending the payment cycle too much. That way we're able to protect our margins. I think our margins are very much eaten away by delayed and protracted payments. And that's one of the issues that we're seeing today, and something that's been happening over the past couple of years. This year a little bit more.
And presumably for the rebar sector, possibly also on the structural side, but if you're supplying metal to a contractor, they might be working for another contractor who's then working for another contractor and a client. So
Correct.
you don't have, whilst your immediate clients might have a good payment record, you don't necessarily have visibility all the way up the food chain. Is that a challenge?
I'm glad you mentioned that. This is one of the things that we've become a little bit more cautious of. Our due diligence has obviously gotten much, much better over the years. We no longer take a project knowing the contractor only. We want to know who the client is for that contractor. And a lot of the times we try and assess from our side the business model. So what is the purpose of that building or structure coming up? If that building is for off-plan sales, for example, we tend to be a little bit cautious about that given the market today. If it's an infrastructure job, we know what to expect in terms of payment cycles, so we deal with it accordingly. Generally speaking, if you're dealing with a project which is for the nation here, the economy, and it's government-backed, you're not concerned about not being paid. You're quite comfortable that you will be paid. Fine, payments can sometimes go up and down, but you know that you're safe with that specific contractor. Whereas in the private sector, sometimes it is a little bit more challenging. There are businesses that are a little bit more ill-conceived, plans, business plans that haven't been thought out completely. So we try to be a little bit careful on where we supply as well.
So in terms of where we are today, you're saying it's tough at the moment. Is it particularly acute, the pain that the steel industry is feeling at the moment, the oversupply and the slowdown, or is this just a regular, cycle? Are you particularly concerned at the moment?
We are very concerned because even though we've been through several cycles, we find that within our sector there's been newer entrants who haven't been through these cycles. And our bigger concern is their ability to go through this today. Anyone sort of not able to go through this specific cycle is going to be perceived as a defaulter, and in turn the industry gets looked at that way, which does impact us.
There's a kind of net effect.
Exactly.
Asim, if I can come back to you then. So what do we do next? So you've described the challenges of the moment, the oversupply, the issues of late payments, new players coming to the market who perhaps don't communicate so effectively or coordinate so effectively. What can we do about this? How can we turn it around?
Well, I think if we try and simplify it a bit more, because we could talk all day about what we could do and what we cannot do. But if we look at it from the business-specific terms, I think businesses have to change the way they do business. We're looking at alternative markets as well. We were principally focused 90% on UAE, GCC. As the markets have adjusted to the new reality, looking at more further away export markets where payment practices are different, maybe shorter, maybe more secured. So I think businesses now need to look at evolving with the changing practice. So, but you can only do that to a certain extent.
If you don't mind me asking, which markets have those better conditions?
We're looking at the Far East, for instance. We're looking at Asia, subcontinent markets, where payment terms are shorter. And
what they have local suppliers who you'll be then, you'll be the new entrants.
They do have, but I mean, I think the development now, let's say for instance, India is going through tremendous development opportunities. What Dubai went through, what the UAE went through, what the GCC went through. We're now seeing Asia rise. And I think if you look at India as a possible market, you're looking at the Far East, of course, as a possible market. We're looking at focusing on more different sectors, maybe oil and gas, less construction. We can do that in structural steel, focus on more flat steel products and that cater more towards specific industries which are have a healthier financial model or cash flow.
If I can pick on a couple of the points you just made. So firstly, looking at new markets with better payment records. In the background, there's all this talk about trade wars and increasing global tariffs, particularly from America to China, etc. But India, you mentioned, that has quite a strong record of protectionism. So, how is it a difficult time to be looking?
Well, I mean, it's
markets?
like any other market. If there's a local industry that's producing that particular product, then there'll be protection. If there's not a local industry producing that product, then they'll be reliant on imports from anywhere around the world. We've had inquiries even from South America for steel. So it's incredible. It's just a question of getting your product out. Africa is another great growth potential market with different payment terms. So I think like where we were doing maybe 90% local, we might be doing now, opting to do more like 60% local and 40% more into these types of markets. So that's the first change. Second change, of course, is as an industry, we all need to perhaps look at best practices and follow best practices. Practices that I remember when I came in '95 to Dubai, a 90 to 120-day credit cycle was more than sufficient to collect your money and pay your suppliers, pay your banks, and buy new steel and carry on with the. But that has, through the global financial crisis, the oil price falls and everything has become extended. So working together with other industry players in your industry, like for other steel traders, understanding collective problems, working together, trying to save costs by economies of scale, maybe setting up some kind of networking with each other to try and promote the best practices that should be followed in the industry. At the moment, everybody is like, trying to undercut each other in a very unhealthy manner. And so I think that that's a second level. And I think on the third level, the government is very supportive and can continue to increase that support. Late payments, like I said, is the number one problem, I think, and extended payments. So perhaps a late payment law.
And is there any talk within the government of introduction of a late payment law or supporting?
I think we're blessed to be in a place where the government's always got their ears open. They're always receptive to new ideas, to how to promote better environments and everything. And yes, we often, I think you guys are doing a white paper as well, if I'm not mistaken, suggesting on how to improve conditions in the market. These are all initiatives by private players in conjunction with public sector, with the government, to try and improve the market. So yes, I think through Emirates Steel, for instance, which is again a government owned industry, we have these discussions with them, and they're also looking at having a healthy distribution model and a healthy steel market over here. So they're also interested in having that. So there is an ear which gets back to the people that make decisions. And
if I can come to Rohit on some of so what is it the same for the rebar community? I'm guessing that on the rebar side, if you've got an oversupply, it's easier to take it to other markets, whereas structural steel takes longer to produce and might be more bespoke. Is that correct?
Not necessarily the case. I mean, markets like Africa is a manageable place to export, but as Asim said, most of these, I think you said it, most of these markets have their own producers, and they have their own specifications. So what regulates who can supply and who can't supply in the market is that specification. So yes, even though we can export it out and we do have a relatively liquid product in terms of rebar, it's not always that straightforward to be able to send it out. We are very much sort of affected by what's happening locally over here in terms of information flow, the speed at which prices are moving does affect us very quickly here.
And in terms of the stronger growth markets and the tougher markets, where do you think within the region, and I'm thinking of the Middle East and North Africa region, not just the GCC, where are the sort of growth opportunities, or where you think there are still projects, there's still rising demand? I mean, what's in my mind is Egypt and Iraq and these kind of new markets, or relatively new. Is that correct?
I think Iraq has been around for some time now. Iraq is, I think, always going to be an option as a market. There is a concern with places like Egypt and Iraq, and that's the ability to actually operate within those markets and having the know-how of those markets. They're not the same as these markets here, in the UAE, where the ease of doing business is it's phenomenal. I mean, you can start a business tomorrow, within 24 hours you're in business. So they're very quick here. I mean, Egypt and Iraq is a market we've looked at several times. As a business, we've looked at sort of diversifying our product portfolio. So more than just doing rebar, we do a lot of wire processing, for example. So we're looking at some of these other value-added products, which are very, very easily exportable, and they go on more secure terms.
Yeah.
So we're not exposing ourselves to these 150, 180, or 210 days of open credit. You're in a situation where you're dealing with LCs and payments are in hand before the goods leave. So that's basically where we're at on the rebar side.
And in terms of, Asim mentioned looking more at the other industries, so oil and gas particularly, and clearly we have a slowdown on real estate. We have a pickup coming on the oil and gas sides, particularly in Abu Dhabi and in Saudi Arabia. Is that the same on your side of the market?
I mean, our product is definitely something that goes into the oil and gas as well. It's less specialized. It is much more of a commoditized product, where we're not really fabricating elements for the various items going into oil and gas, whether it's a rig or otherwise. It's a market we're definitely more focused on. Infrastructure is something we've gotten a lot of interest in the past several years. We've spent a lot of time penetrating that, whether it's bridges, tunnels, airports. We were involved with the Dubai International Airport project, for example. These are things that we've been doing over the years just to, I guess, mitigate the risk of the real estate sector coming down, which, as you can see, there is a consolidation in that sector today.
Yeah. And if we look at your ability to finance your own businesses, are the banks, they're hearing the message about oversupply and lower margins. Does that make it more difficult for steel producers to raise credit and to invest, or is the banks are sympathetic?
I think you'll find that the banks, because they've been dealing with certain people for so many years, they're very comfortable with those people, knowing that these are not the sort of organizations that won't stay with their commitments. The newer entrants as on today, I think they would find it quite challenging to enter the markets. But companies that have been around through several cycles, like us and ours, we do find it challenging in terms of raising funds for things other than what we're doing. But with regards to what we're doing, I think the banks are very comfortable.
Sorry, what do you mean things other than what we're doing?
If you wanted to do another project, for example, totally unrelated to what you do as a business, I think the banks are taking a more, if I may say so, more proactive approach towards knowing who their customer is today, where they won't just give you money because you have a project feasibility that sounds good. I think they are looking at track record today. I don't personally believe that it's sort of a business plan you put in front and say, look, I want to get this done, and I believe that these are the returns, and they say, yes, here's the money. I don't think it's quite that straightforward anymore. I think they are looking at track record.
They're increasing their due diligence, just as everybody else is increasing.
I believe so. I believe so, and because of the track record, I think the banks are comfortable dealing with companies, as I said to you, that have been around for 20, 30 years.
But if I could just add to that,
yeah, sure.
I think the stress that we're seeing more so is with customers and their bank financing and their lending. Now we're seeing perhaps the customers that we're getting, the smaller companies, smaller customers that we have are not able to get the bank lending like they once used to. And that also tends to end up putting pressure on the supply chain. So it's not just our ability to raise finance, but the customer's ability to raise finance.
Yeah,
and I think that's becoming more challenging in the recent couple of years. And again, that needs to be looked at. So I just wanted to add that.
But I want to end up by asking about next steps. But before I do that, I've just thought of another question whilst we're talking. There's obviously a global trend to tackle climate change, reduce carbon footprint. Does that put particular pressure on steel producers? It's a very energy-intensive industry. I guess you can't get away from steel, but does that affect things much? Is there a reduction in demand as people might shift to new materials? Or
Well, I think if we talk about China, for instance, pollution and China and pollution coming from steel mills, this has been going on for quite a number of years now. China is suffering from a lot of pollution coming from plants like steel. So what we're seeing is the less efficient plants being gradually shut down, and the bigger plants, which are running on a more efficient production cycle, focused on. But this is a good thing, because at the end of the day, we need a reduction in the capacity. So pollution is probably a good thing to try, and it's better for the environment, of course, and of course, in terms of dynamics, to keep steel prices at a commercially viable level. And steel production, it needs to be corrected. So I think pollution is definitely one of the factors.
Part of raising the quality standards, I guess.
Without a doubt, without a doubt.
Very much so.
Okay, let's move on to next steps then. So we've touched on where we are today, what what you'd like to see happening. What is happening in terms of, you've touched on new markets, but in terms of the industry talking to better coordination amongst producers, government action on payment terms or forms of contract, what are the next steps? What's happening and what are the next steps?
Well, I mean, we think, we as an industry, the structural steel industry, now we feel that by setting up a non-profit incorporated organization, we can sort of try and save costs. For instance, if we look at 8 or 9 of us major players getting medical insurance. Medical insurance, it sounds like a funny subject, but in 10 years, our medical insurance bill for our staff has been one of the biggest increases of expenses as the laws changed and it became compulsory, and then, as it progressed. So
it's not because of a worsening safety record, it's because of the increasing...
we were able to self-insure once upon a time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you can't do an in-house insurance.
Okay, so with that, some of the companies that you're working with are talking about a common medical insurance
absolutely.
policy?
If we have we're thinking of, not thinking, we're in the process of establishing a Steel Traders Association, NPIO, in the DIFC to promote best practices in the industry to promote the industry as a whole to banks who are prospective lenders, show them that it is a strategic sector. It is a cyclical sector. It has its ups, it has its downs. It's not like soap where you have a constant amount of X amount of soap you're supplying and the profit margins are like, we're in the commodity sector. So it's creating awareness about the brand, about the steel and whatnot.
So what is NPIO then?
It's a non-profit incorporated organization.
Oh, okay. So it's not. I thought it was the name of the organisation.
No, no.
Does the organisation have a name?
Yes. Well, interestingly enough, we had one of our informal meetings together before we're setting it up, and we were coming up with either SSTA, which is a Structural Steel Traders Association, but I think in the last discussion we thought let's make it a wider one. Let's make it a Steel Traders Association. So it just doesn't have to be structural. It can be expanded out to producers, to other rebar traders, and collectively as an industry, we have a lot of common problems that can be addressed together. So then the its potential is unlimited.
And so where is that initiative at the moment?
It's with lawyers at the moment. The lawyers are just drafting up the constitution. We've all paid in whatever we needed to pay in, and we feel that within the next 2 months or so, we should have, provided the DIFC approves our request, we should be in a position to start with the organization.
And what happens then? So the organization will presumably have regular gatherings and produce papers. And
One of the other good things is networking. Networking within the industry. It's so important. And to make sure that the best practices are being followed. So by us all meeting together and discussing these common issues, and that's what we're going to start doing, having a regular forum for us to meet, discuss problems, and find solutions, and also to speak to other industry participants or maybe other levels of government or whatever, to try and create an environment that is conducive for the economy, for the industry. And I think it's not just us, even the contractors, our customers. An interesting thing is our customers are beginning to find out what we're doing. And they're also saying, perhaps we should do this as well. And we should get together and discuss our common issues. Of course, it's limited to the extent, it's not going to be like a magic bullet that solves all the problems. But dialogue, interaction, networking can help to...
And Rohit, you said on the rebar side, one of the issues is communication between different parts of the industry.
Correct.
Is this association, is this something that would work for the rebar producers also, or is the dynamic slightly different?
No, I think this is something that could definitely work for the rebar industry. First thing it brings in is transparency, which can never hurt. That's always a positive thing. We're able to react to market needs and requirements a lot quicker as well. It is a very dynamic industry. It's something that isn't sort of it's not stagnant. It's something that moves very, very quickly. Prices move in China, they move over here the next day. Prices move in America, they impact us here. So, there's a lot of things that happen within the industry. So this is something that would very much help. It also gives us a better understanding of our market. Yes, individually we all have we like to believe we have a great understanding of our market, but if this platform was to come into effect, it's something that I feel that could result in a lot more depth of understanding, which is a very positive thing, not just for us, but for our customers as well.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to bring the conversation to an end now. I just wonder if I start with you, Rohit, is there any final point that we've not made so far that you'd like to make about the state of the market, or what you would like to see happening? Or?
I think I touched upon it just now. I think the transparency is a great thing. In terms of a platform, I think the structural guys are a little further ahead in the game when it comes to this than we are. So this is something that I think that we could definitely learn from. It's something that I would like to propose within our own rebar industry as well. And potentially, I think you had mentioned about the possibility of a larger organization. That's maybe something that I think could, have a solution going forward.
Very good. And Asim, any final points?
Well, I think just coming back to where we started from, which is the delayed payments. It's the delayed payments which need, we need a voice. We need to be able to talk about it. We need to network and find common solutions on how to rectify that issue. I'd like to go back to the 90 to 120 day credit cycle. And I think hopefully with a bit of, changes in the way we do business, we've got to keep up that goal and that goal has to be reached through collaborating together and encouraging best practices in the market.
Excellent. Well, Asim Siddiqui and Rohit Valrani, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Well done.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank you.